you to everyone for joining us today. We're really happy to have you here with us as we pivot to a MTSS Fest, to a virtual event. It's not maybe what we had envisioned, but we're so excited that you're here to join with us. And I would really first like to thank our hosts and our sponsors, the UW Smart Center, Kaiser Permanente, and the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction. My name is Emily Rang, and I am the Director of Data Governance at OSPI, and I have the honor of being your host for this session. So please make sure that you share your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation, and we will try to answer as many as we can. And it is my honor to welcome Brian Gaunt from the University of South Florida, who's the MTSS Interproject Coordinator. Let's go ahead and turn over and get started. And Brian, I'm going to pass the screen sharing off to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily. Can you hear me okay, first of all?
Yes.
All right, great, wonderful. I'll go ahead and then share my screen. Welcome, everybody, and good afternoon, or good morning, I should say, to you all on the Pacific Coast. I'm currently in Florida on the East Coast. And just a real quick note, just to say, I hope everyone's staying safe and taking care of yourselves and loved ones. So with everything that's going on, I appreciate your participation here and your attendance. So we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and switch to my screen sharing. So Emily, if you'll just give me the thumbs up, let me know you can see it. Fantastic. All right. So as Emily mentioned, if you do have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to share those with us in the chat box, and then Emily will let me know to pause and then address questions that come up for us. So again, welcome. So I am with the University of South Florida's Florida PBIS project, but I also have worked as a liaison with our Florida RTI or MTSS project that's also housed here at the University of South Florida. And over the years, our collaboration between the two projects has been an effort to promote a unified model of MTSS such that both academic and behavioral support services are all combined in a unified way and certainly aligned to the whole child perspective. And so in this presentation, what I'd like to try to share with you all is just a little bit of guidance of how we're trying to promote database decision-making practices in Florida with this in the MTSS context. And so I'll be specifically getting into the aspect over how to monitor the implementation of your MTSS system, inclusive, of course, of PBIS practices. But then more importantly, how to use that information that you're collecting about the fidelity of your practices and the impacts that that's having on your student outcomes. And so to do that, I'll be highlighting a case study and just giving you some examples and demonstrations of that as we go forward. Just to provide a little bit of an agenda or structure for you guys, just so you know where we're headed. I want to start by first just setting some stage for making sure we have common language and common understanding for MTSS. There are some aspects of MTSS that states or districts are defining that sometimes might be a little different in different places. Essentially, the core features tend to all be pretty consistent, but again, just for stage setting, I think it's important that we have that common language. I'll then share a brief overview of a structured database problem-solving process and provide a context in which this process fits in your MTSS framework and how to understand why it's important for adopting and using in your schools. But that is to say, this is really just an overview of that process just for context so that I can demonstrate the specific aspect of using different sources of data to monitor your implementation and evaluate its impacts. That problem-solving process, by the way, if you don't already currently have a structured model of working with data in team-based settings, just so you know, that presentation itself or training on problem-solving process is really a multi-day event. And to implement it well and with fidelity, it really requires a long-term plan and strategic approach through implementation stages. But again, just for context here, I will be providing a little bit of an overview just so that then I can demonstrate some of the efforts for our topic today. So in section 3 of our agenda, I'll spend the majority of our time just kind of highlighting this process and then the kinds of data that are being used in each step so that you can begin to see then how we can look at that. And then I'll close out the presentation with just a brief recommendation of some of the considerations that folks at the district level, central office, might want to consider as they think about how to support this process being used in schools, but more importantly, being used with Fidelity. So let's talk a little bit about MTSS. In the state of Florida, we characterize MTSS as having essentially 6 components. Just as a little background to developing this model of MTSS, back in the day when both RTI and PBIS were kind of coexisting in this new world of education, we both had 2 projects, that here in Florida. We had our own little, our own tools for implementing a tiered structure and database decision-making practices. And it seemed to us as we were collaborating that it would be more efficient for schools if we just had one tool that could do both academic and behavior focus rather than just as separate kinds of efforts that we know we want to integrate in the area of practices and impacts on students, but yet from this kind of organizational lens, you know, how does that work? And how do we make that function? So as we looked at our different tools, we started to look at the kinds of practices that each project was interested in promoting, that there was more commonality than differences. And so those commonalities rested in these 6 different domains, of which we've then conducted a variety of factor analyses and such to confirm that these 6 domains are independent enough of each other to stand alone, but yet obviously have an interaction effect that occurs between them. So when we're describing MTSS to folks, we try to emphasize that MTSS is really not the goal. The goal, of course, is improving outcomes for your schools, your staff, and your students, of course, and families. MTSS is just a framework for how to organize the sum total of all the various practices and supports that we have available to provide our staff and our students so that we have a coherent way of organizing all those resources towards the same outcomes of improving students' successes. And so the top 2 components you see here on the screen really essentially represent the core components of MTSS from our framework here in Florida. These are the things that we specifically are wanting to implement when we say we're going to do MTSS in our schools. So the multiple tiers of instruction intervention supports, you know, that's that buffet of just everything under the sun that we have to offer kids. Whether it's prevention supports for behavior, academic, mental health, all the way up through the continuum to crisis management and rehabilitation at a tier 3 level. And so it's important for language that we recognize that the tiers themselves don't represent the students. The tiers are the things that we have to give kids. And just like you would walk into a restaurant and go to a place where, where they have a buffet, different people want different things from that buffet at different times and different amounts. And so that's kind of what our tiers are meant to serve, is that we have something for everyone should they need it. Now, knowing what to give kids, when to give it, for how long, how much of a dosage, those are decisions that we make when we engage in a team-based structured problem-solving process. And that process provides us a structure or a roadmap, if you will, for how to know what data to look at, in what order, and then how to use that information for decision-making in the areas of, kind of understanding why the problem exists, then knowing what to do about those problems or those barriers that are affecting our goals, implementing a plan, whether it's an intervention plan, let's say at tiers 2 or 3, or an improvement plan, let's say at tier 1. And then, having that plan implemented, then what was the impact of it? And that's going to be the focus mainly for today's session, is that combination of steps 3 and 4 of this process, where we've implemented a plan, we're trying to make some changes in our school in order to improve our outcomes, and now we're coming back to the table after a long period of time of putting those actions in place to see what impacts it's having. The bottom 4 components are essentially implementation drivers, if you will. These are practices or infrastructures and resources that you would expect schools to already have available, but they may require some reconfigurations or realignments in order to support the implementation of your tiered options for kids, as well as then the implementation of this structured team-based problem-solving process. So when we talk about leadership in MTSS, it's not just that leaders are leading in a generic sense, but in this context of problem-solving, leaders really serve as the role models and the coaching supports day-to-day on-site for staff. So school-based leadership teams certainly are the primary focus when we provide training on MTSS implementation. The leadership team then builds up their fluency and knowledge of understanding of how to do MTSS so that then they can provide the structured coaching, technical assistance, or training to their staff on how to do this. And that brings us then to the capacity building infrastructure component. We need to have sufficient coaching and technical assistance services to help the adults who are working directly with students to implement the practices that we would like to see or to maintain the existing practices that are already happening in the area of instruction or assessment that we want to preserve. Communication and collaboration is getting into a variety of aspects regarding how we share and communicate and access our data, how we work together in teams, interpersonal communication skills, having multidisciplinary team structures at both the leadership team level as well as your PLC or grade levels, as well as your tier 2 and tier 3 problem solving team-based contexts. And the data evaluation component is really referring to the various practices and resources we have available for folks to access the right data at the right time for making decisions. And so this brings up your technology as far as data platforms, as well as brings up procedures around data collection, as well as data reporting and access. And so I'm going to be highlighting the use of these components as we go through this, this presentation today. But again, this is just a way for us to think about the different practices that schools are already doing and how we can help them to make use of those existing practices to implement a tiered structure and way of work for students. So thinking about RTI and PBIS, I thought it would be helpful also for us here as a context to just really understand how similar these structures are. And just so you know that, yes, there are times when we just want to just laser focus on our PBIS effort. Maybe we're brand new to PBIS, maybe a year, 2 or 3 into it. And there are times when you do need to have just a very singular siloed focus on one domain of student outcomes, whether it's our tier 1 for reading or our tier 1 for math or behavior. But then there are times when we want to step back and remember, though, that there's really no such thing as a kid who only has behavior or only has academic performance. All children have both occurring constantly and together. And so there's this reciprocal relationship in the way that we approach understanding student performance in schools. But the structures of PBIS and RTI, though, are where we can see this tiered structure taking place. So as I mentioned in the slide before, both RTI and PBIS share the same 6 components as we define it in our Florida process or work here. And the tiers, again, don't represent the students as much as they represent the things that we have to offer students. Now, on the academic side, most folks are used to the vocabulary of having standards that specifically guide us as far as what students should know and be able to do at the end of a particular grade level as they progress through the grades, of course, towards graduation. And then the curriculum instruction resources or strategies or practices that we use to help them reach those standards are also pretty well understood. These are things that we know are already happening pretty much in our schools, but that instruction and curriculum might not be matched to what students need at a particular time, or it might not be differentiated enough to handle the diversity of our learning needs. And then, of course, you have your assessment tools, strategies, and resources and practices. And so the combination of standards, curriculum instruction, assessments, these are what we basically define and characterize as the tiers. On the behavior side, the same structure exists, but instead of calling them standards, we refer to them as school-wide expectations. So this is where we start. These are the goals that we have for kids. We want kids to be able to be performing this way. And so to help them to reach that expectation, this is where the sum total of all of your current SEL programs, restorative justice practices, trauma-informed care practices, mental health prevention programs, social skill programs. These are all the different things for curriculum instruction that you have available that you can start to provide students specifically to helping them to meet your expectations for behavior at the school. And then, of course, just like we see on the academic side of this, we need to have a variety of assessment options to help us to screen for kids who need help, diagnose those issues that they have to really get at the root causes, monitor how they respond to interventions or services we provide them, and then how to evaluate the impacts of our work as we try to improve their outcomes. So when we talk about the tiers for academics and behavior, we're still on both camps talking about standards, curriculum instruction, and assessments. But again, both models require a structured data-based or team-based problem-solving process. And so we do see sometimes, that in schools, problems are typically defined as either an academic problem or behavior problem. But I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about the fact that a whole child perspective requires us to understand that in every case, whether we're talking large numbers of kids at tier 1, or a group of kids at tier 2, or an individual student at tier 3, academic performance and social, emotional, or behavioral competencies are interwoven and combined, and they exist in every case. Now, so the priority concern might be defined to us as kids are not reading at grade level, for example. But as we diagnose and understand the barriers to why those kids are not on grade level, we may find some valid reasons regarding, lack of behavioral competencies or social emotional skills that are interfering with their ability to access or engage in the instruction that they're getting. So if classrooms are using evidence-based curricula, they're using instructional practices that are highly engaging, they're culturally relevant lessons, they're designed for universal access, and of course aligned to state standards, then those classrooms have a high probability of preventing problem behaviors because they're enhancing the learning environment and allowing kids to better access and engage the instruction. And then conversely, when classrooms are using evidence-based behavior instruction or management practices, those practices are being differentially provided based on need and through a trauma-informed, culturally sensitive or restorative lens, then those classrooms can also improve, reciprocally the academic performance of those students because it's also enhancing the climate and improving access and engagement to the instruction. So as I go through this presentation, I want to maintain this understanding, this logic that while sometimes, again, it's important to, from a siloed perspective, to look at just reading of implementing this new curriculum or implementing our new differentiated instructional practices or implementing UDL, that sometimes that requires a narrow focus, and there's certainly a place for that. But in this particular venue of this conference, I thought it might be helpful if we try to maybe think about this idea of problem solving and database decision making with this whole child perspective. And just to further kind of illustrate this, imagine, if you will, a problem is brought to the table for your school-based leadership team or your tier 1 grade level PLC. And the problem is defined just, here generically as a percentage of students that are not performing proficiently on their state assessment for ELA. And so as we dig into understanding why so many students are not performing well on their ELA assessment or why they're not at proficiency levels, we may find that that problem is being influenced by a lack of access to instruction. For example, when kids have chronic absenteeism, when kids are being suspended a lot or they're going to the office a lot, that's lost instructional time. And so lost instructional time, we know, is a high predictor of students who don't perform well academically on their assessments. Students who have social emotional needs that aren't being met, anxiety type symptoms, depression type symptoms, ADHD type issues, these create kind of cognitive barriers, if you will, for students to access instruction. They may physically be there to access it, but cognitively they may not be. And so again, when we think about a problem as being an academic problem, we may find as we diagnose the barriers to why that problem exists, that there are indeed some social, emotional, behavioral variables to address. And then conversely, on the other side of this, we might start out by defining a problem at our school as we have too many kids with ODRs for disruption in the classrooms. And then we're seeing, it's all grades and all subgroups that are particularly involved in this. But then as we diagnose that situation and get more into the why behind we have all these disruptions in our classrooms, we may be asking ourselves, what is it about the classroom situation that is triggering so many disruptive behaviors among students? And then doing that kind of diagnostic work, we may find that, some of the academic tasks or demands in the classroom are kind of above where students instructionally are operating. And that kind of a gap in instructional level versus frustrational level, certainly can create a condition where students want to escape or avoid that instruction. So again, I just don't want us to get hung up on whether it's an academic problem or behavior problem, but rather it's a combination of looking at both. So I'm going to highlight tier 1 as the example here, because this is something that I'm still finding even in our state of Florida, but even perhaps in other states, as you've observed. folks, still are grappling with how to have a healthy tier one. And so when we ask schools, what does your triangle look like? What we're essentially saying is take all the students in your school and pick a content area in this case, just to simplify it. So we'll say, in the area of reading, what does your triangle look like for reading outcomes? And if the majority of students are so far behind performance goals that they need intensive services, and then other kids need tier two, essentially what we're saying is your core is not healthy enough. So the question here is, does your triangle look like an hourglass? Does it look like a rectangle, an upside down triangle? Any of these images, other than the classic triangle MTSS image that we're all used to seeing, suggests that your school is trying to fix a tier one problem by putting a lot of kids into tier two and or tier three. The fact remains, though, is that you cannot fix a bad tier one or an unhealthy tier one by putting everybody into interventions. And so this idea of this triangle logic, again, just for common language, is that the work we do on behalf of kids should be effective such that the majority of kids do not need supplemental services. Everything we do in our tier one core grade level environment really should be sufficient, academic, behavior, social, emotional, to help kids to reach their performance goals at that grade level without requiring additional assistance at tiers 2 or 3. And so the reason for that and I want to preface this with some sensitivity of the climate and the situation that we're in. I certainly don't want to trigger any kind of negative or traumatic situations right now. It's a very, very precarious time, but there has been a lot of talk in the media and in news publications about this concept of flattening the curve. And I want to just see if I could just take this opportunity to make this a learning opportunity for us. The logic behind that is where this triangle comes from. It's a public health model that's highlighting for us that in every system we have finite resources to provide individuals who are not doing well. And if we have too many of those folks, then we have resources to help. Then the resources we do provide them, A, aren't going to be effective enough to help them, and B, we're going to end up running out of resources. So this is that concept of flattening the curve. We want our tier one efforts to be so strong and so preventative that the number of kids we have to treat at tiers 2 and 3 aren't as overwhelming as the resources we have to provide. So now let me ask you to just imagine for a moment that you're a school that's been operating for the last 3 years at improving your school outcomes, and the hard work's paying off. You've got your school grade now going from a D to a B in the last 3 years. Obviously, room for improvement to get to a grade of B. But the question here that I want you to hold in the back of your mind as we go through this is, how are you going to sustain that success? I mean, do you even know what led to the success? The whole issue here is trying to find what works is like having a large bucket of dead batteries, but there's one brand new battery in there and you don't know where it is, but you're going to have to sift through one at a time until you find it. When you find it, you want to hold on to it. You want to lock it in place and you want to solidify it as this is how we do things at our school because it works. What we see oftentimes is that when PBIS or MTSS is implemented in schools, it gets going so well with the school-based leadership team, but then members of that team, particularly the administrators, move to another school and then the work falls apart. So how do we maintain the practices that we know are working, and then how do we keep monitoring what's continuing to work and what might need still to be changed? And that's going to be the focus of our talk now. So I don't have time to show this video, but there is a link here at the bottom, and I encourage you all to check this out. The question really here is what can we do to not only improve our core tier one, but what can we do to sustain the work that actually is having a positive impact? And so this study here that folks from the University of Oregon have conducted, it was specific to PBIS, but still generally applies to MTSS. And so these were 4 practices that they found that existed consistently in schools that had strong, healthy cores, as well as had been sustaining that progress and benefit for multiple years. So using your fidelity of implementation data along with your school discipline data in combination is what's going to help you to know formatively through each school year and then annually year after year how to make modifications, tweak, or adjustments to your system so that it continues to get the outcomes that you'd like to see for your tier one. Now, having data, of course, is important, and we want to make sure that we have that data. But the fact remains, though, is that it's what we do with the data that matters. And not all data is equal. There's lots of data we collect in our schools that's important because it is required in policy or procedures somewhere above to report that information. So collecting to report is certainly an important function in our schools, but that's not the same thing as using data for problem solving. So when we think about getting everybody in the school building involved collaboratively in a team-based approach to solving barriers that kids are having, this really now brings us into the lens of how different people problem solve differently. So just to give you two extremes, some people solve problems by ignoring that their problem exists. That's just kind of human behavior. Some people solve problems by just getting into it, digging into it, and then pulling it apart piece by piece until they find the answer. But research over the years has shown what particular steps work and don't work, or that is to say, have a higher likelihood of producing a solution that works. And so when those steps are present, we have a higher chance of finding solutions. So when we talk about doing a problem-solving approach, we really want to make sure that as we're implementing this way of work and this idea of database decision-making with teams, that we do have on-site that leadership and coaching system set up to provide direct training and technical assistance, as well as to ensure the fidelity of this database problem-solving process. So what should our data be useful for then when we talk about, schools should use their student performance data or fidelity data? Well, first of all, for effective decision-making in this MTSS context, we need data that's going to help us to define the problem. Most schools typically have more than one problem. So it really just comes down to a preference at first for you and your team is what's your priority right now? And then use that priority to then dig into other areas. But we want to define in a statement what that problem is that we're prioritizing at the moment. And we want to make sure that that statement is measurable and observable, that we can make sure that how it looks today, we can see how it changes over time. We also need data that's going to help us to analyze kind of the root causes behind why the problem exists. So we refer to these sometimes as barriers. Students aren't able to read at grade level for their language arts. Okay, what are some possible reasons for that? And then we can consider those reasons as barriers. If we remove the barriers, then students should be able to reach the goals. But sometimes we're picking hypotheses or assumptions about the barriers that we don't have evidence to prove exists. And this is where we can get into trouble and make decisions that aren't really valid. So you can imagine sometimes a situation where we're saying so many students are chronically absent because at home there isn't a value for school, or students and parents really aren't responsible about getting to school. And so maybe that works in some places, but what if we gave out a survey to both staff and students and found out that what students are reporting is not what staff are assuming? If we had only run with our assumptions and not collected additional data to really confirm our assumptions, we could end up putting a lot of actions into place, spend a lot of resources trying to make those actions come alive, and then have no impact on our outcomes because we chose barriers that we really didn't have evidence existed. They were just assumptions we had. We also need data to help us to monitor the progress of our implementation of our plan. And that's our fidelity data. And then of course, we also need to have some data to collect to monitor how students are performing or responding to the strategies that we're going to implement. And then finally, we're going to need data to evaluate how it impacted. And this is typically the same sources of data that brings us back to step one. So this brings us now to that problem-solving process. It's a cyclical process. It's an evidence-based process. And it generally has 4 questions that we're asking. Just what's the problem? Why is it happening? What are we going to do about it? And is it working? And so again, in the context of this presentation, I don't have time to really dig into a lot of the real intricacies around this process, but I do have a couple of handouts that are available for you if you'd like to get a little bit closer knowledge as far as what this process looks like in Florida, as well as how it might look or sound differently across the tiers. But generally this process, there are multiple models of problem solving is what I'm getting at. And so I don't want you to get hung up on the fact that it has to be Florida's model, or it has to be TIPS, or it has to be this, or it has to be that. Generally, I just want you to understand though that everybody in your school or even in your district should be using this same model. If we talk about problem solving with different vocabulary, different concepts, different sequences of steps, that's going to create barriers for our team to come to consensus on actions and then share the responsibility to make it work. So we have one universal structured process for guiding the data that we're going to use in a certain sequence of questions to then arrive at a solution that we can then implement and monitor. So to get us ready to start thinking about this case study, then I want you to think about whether or not folks in your school have a problem-solving mindset. Another way to frame that is to say, there are people who are ready to solve problems, and then there are people who are stuck admiring a problem. And you can hear this when people are talking about problems, whatever the problem is, even with your loved ones at home, whether it's with coworkers, whether it's with students, or whether it's with team-based problem solving. When folks are talking about problems, you can get a sense of whether or not they're just stuck kind of ruminating the fact that we have a problem to deal with. Oh, I hate that we have this problem to deal with. And it becomes a blame game, it becomes a venting session, it almost starts to sound like a therapy session more so than a problem-solving session. But when we have a problem-solving mindset, we have a growth mindset essentially. We're solution-focused, we're managing our own anxieties about the fact that we have a problem, and all of that comes with who thinks about us in what way and how we're going to be graded or evaluated. We avoid absolutes. We don't make statements like this always happens to us, or this never is going to work, or every time. Those kinds of things typically don't exist in the real world. It's conditional. And so we understand that the outcomes we get is because of the way we're set up. It's like some folks often say, it's every system is perfectly aligned for the outcomes it gets. So if you don't like your outcomes, then let's just adjust our system. But it's just knowing that growth mindset that if we grow, we can change and improve our outcomes. So as another handout for you, there are some guiding questions that I provided to you, and there's no real, there's no real like strong consensus that you have to have these many questions or these specific questions, but these generally are the questions that come up when you look at the way people approach tier 1 problem solving. So you see the 4 steps there, but in each step you have sub-questions. The idea behind using questions to guide our talks or our discussions around data is really key here. Data chaos exists, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this. If you bring a team together that don't understand what the agenda is about, and they don't understand what role they're there to support or what responsibilities they have to participate in using data, and then you just dump a lot of different sources and types of data in front of that team and then say to them openly, what do you think, or what are the problems that you see? You're going to get chaos. You're going to get different perspectives, different ideas, emotional responses, logical responses. And that's going to eat away at your efficiency and effectiveness at solving problems in your school. To minimize that, we use structured process through basically asking questions. So the question drives what data we should be looking at and how we should be looking at it in combination with other sources. That minimizes trying to look at data that right now either isn't relevant or isn't appropriate for the stage of problem solving that we're going through. So let's start with step 1, problem identification. So in the purpose of this step is to define the scope of the problem to be solved in relation to an existing goal or criteria, and then develop a short-term goal to improve the problem. And so at the outcome of this step, we should then have that statement of the problem that is measurable and observable, and then the criteria for knowing whether or not we have solved the problem. There's times when I've seen teams define a problem, but it hasn't been specific enough, and the team hasn't really quite gelled around the consistency or the consensus around the problem, that then what happens is they get to step 4 at the end when we're asking ourselves, did our efforts to improve the problem work? And we might find that, yes, some of the data shows that it has worked, but other people on the team had a different idea of what the problem was, and they don't see that that data has improved. And so then we have a team at the end of the process saying that they don't agree whether it worked or not. So having a statement that everybody agrees is the problem, and making sure that everybody's on the same page about the criteria for knowing if we have solved it is very important in this step. So let me just demonstrate a little bit of that for you. Just imagine an elementary school here, just kind of really prioritizing their concerns around a lack of proficiency in their ELA performance of students, particularly 3rd and 5th grade. And over the course of several years here, you can see it's been pretty much a flatline set of proficiency rates, whether you're talking about students who are proficient or whether they're emerging towards their proficiency or they're well below that proficiency. And so here's a school that's saying to themselves, on average, we've only got our proficiency, we've only got about maybe 39% of our kids that are proficient on ELA. So when you think about the tiered logic and the importance of 80% at that tier 1, you can see here we've got a huge gap already between what they've got in terms of percent of kids who are proficient versus what we would like to have for our tier 1 health. And so they break that data even further down. They take a look at how they're doing by grade levels across several years. And so here we can see that in terms of trend lines, when it comes to our 3rd grade classrooms over the years, their proficiency growth hasn't really changed much over the years. It's kind of a flat downward trend. Fortunately, though, 4th and 5th grades over the last 5 years have had a steady increase in proficiency rates year after year. So there's some things that are working, there's some things that maybe not be. At this point of the team, they might consider themselves saying, you know what, it seems like 4th and 5th grade have gotten some things going in place, and so maybe just stay out of their way and let that trend continue. But let's maybe just laser focus on 3rd grade and find out how we can get more power out of that. So that could certainly happen at this stage of our conversation. But at the same time, too, we also want to get a sense of, how discrepant is our school compared to our peers. So these would be other elementary schools in our district, as well as other elementaries in the state. And so you can see in this graph here that what they were finding in this school was, even though our 4th and 5th graders seem to be doing better year after year, we're still so far behind the district in the state that we may still need to intervene at that 4th and 5th grade level. So this school basically looked at their ELA data, 3rd and 5th graders, and realized, this is something we need to take a whole school approach on, all grade levels, 3rd through 5th for ELA, to see what we can do to impact that outcome and to make those numbers rise for all grade levels. And so as a further context to looking at that data, they were looking at it from an early warning perspective. And so the idea behind an early warning perspective is this. You start out by first asking yourself, are you happy with your academic outcomes? If you're not happy with your academic outcomes, then we want to start to think about, in advance of the next step of problem solving, step 2, that there could be an interaction with some behavior or social emotional type situations here. So we might start to wonder, how many of these kids who are not proficient in ELA have had high attendance issues or OSS concerns? And if those weren't an issue, then how many of them was it because they weren't really engaged in their instruction? A lot of trips to the nurse, a lot of trips to the office for discipline referrals, or a lot of minors in the classroom, for example. And if it's not that, then maybe it's something to do with the way we're delivering or designing our instruction. And if any of those first 3 are in fact happening, that would explain why we have the poor academic outcomes that we have. Then we have to ask ourselves, what should be happening? And if that's not happening, what is it in our system? This goes back to our MTSS components. What might be missing in those components that would help us to ensure higher quality instruction, better engagement with our students in our classrooms, and greater access to that instruction? So when this school looked at the number of students who were non-proficient, again, 61% of their kids, 3rd through 5th, who are not proficient in their ELA performance metrics, what they found from the early warning data was that 4.8% of them were chronically absent. About 41% of them had had at least one suspension in the school year. The majority of those kids, 80%, had at least 2 or more office discipline referrals in the classroom location specifically for the school year. And about 1/3 of them had at least a D or an F in their ELA course. And so what that was helping the school leadership team to do in defining the problem was to recognize that while, yes, they want to approach ELA outcomes and to improve that particular data source, they couldn't ignore the fact that the majority of kids who were non-proficient had all these office discipline referrals occurring in the classrooms, particularly during ELA instructional time. So for them, right away, they knew there's a question there. What is it about our ELA classroom environments, our teaching times for ELA, that we're getting so many ODRs in the classroom? And is there a direct relationship between that and the fact that these students aren't performing well on their ELA assessment? So in defining their problem, they stated it as only 39% of all 3rd and 5th graders are proficient in their ELA, which is significantly below the 80% criteria for a healthy core and is significantly below their current state and district ELA proficiency averages. And they noted again here that about 80% of those students who are non-proficient also have 2 or more ODRs in the classroom location. So from this point forward in the problem solving process, we're only going to be looking at what is it about the students who are non-proficient in ELA who are also getting all these behavior referrals. What's that connection? What's the issue there? And then can we further diagnose and understand that relationship? As a goal, though, they have essentially two parts. By the end of the school year, they want to go from 39% of students proficient to 45% of students. Now, that's not going to catch them up to the district and state levels, which is between 50 and 60%, but it's a step in the right direction as they try to close that gap between where they are as a school and how other elementary schools are performing. In addition to that, knowing that there's a reciprocal relationship here with some of the behavior outcome data, they also want by the end of the school year next year that the students in classrooms have no more than one office discipline referral. And so that would be generic to all students, 3rd through 5th, but making sure that we don't have all these high numbers of referrals in classroom locations. So this, again, like I said, is where a team really needs to make sure that they're very clear about, because when we have a very well-defined problem statement that's measurable, then it already communicates the sources of data that we're going to come back to in step 4, when we ask ourselves, is what we're trying to do to improve our system actually working? Is it having the impacts we want to see? Are we going from 39% to 45%? Are we going from, students with 2 or more referrals down to students with 1 or 0 referrals in the classroom? So that's what we're going to be looking for. So that takes us to step 2. Now, step 2, I'm going to be honest with you, in the research literature, when you look at the various studies where they have looked at how to implement this problem-solving process in schools, all of the studies have shown that this step tends to have perhaps the lowest amount of fidelity in the way it's conducted. The reason is because there's a tendency in human beings to make assumptions about why things are happening, and then to run with those assumptions. And again, sometimes in our gut, it makes us feel like that's the reason why. But then we have to kind of put that into an if-then statement to really know, is that something that we can do? So this idea of problem analysis here is that we want to come up with hypotheses or assumptions or reasons for why this problem exists that we're targeting. And then for each of those reasons we come up with, go get evidence to show whether or not that's really truly a barrier connected to the problem. It's probably a barrier that exists in your school, but whether it actually is influencing your problem that you've identified in step 1, that's the question. And so we have to go collect that information. So it's a 2-stage kind of a problem analysis step here. You develop your hypotheses. I'm going to show you some examples of how you can do that. And then how you can go about finding evidence for any of them. If you find evidence for some of your assumptions, then the logic is this. If you find evidence that there are practices happening that should not be happening, then do something to make those practices stop happening. If there are things that are not happening that should be happening, then you take actions to make those things happen. That's how we connect evidence-based reasons for why problems exist to the interventions that are appropriately matched to student need. Without that evidence collection around validating these assumptions we come up with, we stand a high probability of selecting strategies that aren't truly matched to solving the problem. So again, not all hypotheses are equally actionable. First of all, this is where your content experts need to be at the table. You need to have them to be able to state, what are some reasons why kids typically have problems in ELA or math or social emotional behaviors in classrooms. Here's what the research says are some typical reasons. All right, so let's go investigate those, see if that's happening here at our school. But they also have to be variables that we can control. Sometimes we might state a hypothesis like, I have so many students who are not performing well in ELA because they come from low-income families. Well, that might be factually true, but let's put that in an if-then statement to see if it's something we have control over, right? I mean, if these students did not come from a low-income home, then they would be performing well on their English language arts assessments. Well, obviously we can't do that. We can't mitigate their low-income status at their home, but we have to unpack what that means to be low-income. Maybe what we're trying to say, though, is these kids might not be getting sufficient supports at home, or these students don't have enough structure and materials at home to practice homework to learn the information. And so if we're more specific about our hypotheses that then are actionable, then we stand a chance to actually make something change and happen. And so there are many variables, of course, that we can all consider. I mean, this is where really the sum total of everything we talk about when we say student relationships. We talk about mental health and wellness. We talk about the learning standards and the frameworks we use for lesson design and delivery. The practices we set up, the universal design in which we make instruction accessible for students. All of these exist in relation to each other. And so it's important for us to know the reciprocal relationship between these different kinds of variables. Now, there's way more variables than any one person in your team is going to have expertise to be able to talk about or communicate with. And so one of the ways that we can organize all of this and make it a little bit simpler is just simply think about 4 different domains of influence. There are variables in the way in which we design, deliver, and provide feedback around instruction that can influence the problem that we have. There are things in our curriculum materials and choices and the way that we make use of those that can affect learning. The environment, how it's situated, how noisy it is, how kids are organized physically to work together, etc. And then of course there are learner variables to consider. Kids might have a lack of prerequisite skills, or they might be motivated to want to escape or to seek attention. They might have limited English needs or proficiencies that affect their ability to understand the instruction. So again, there are ways that we can come up with hypotheses in each of these 4 domains. So just again, for the sake of time, I'm going to rush through just a little bit here, but I don't want to lose sight of the fact though that, you know, for some of you, this might be new. So remember again, their problem statement was on the left there. And so they did their analyses, they came up with their hypotheses, they looked to collect evidence, and they found a number of valid hypotheses. So just to give you that organization of behavior academic, they did find that there were some fidelity issues with their PBIS structure. Expectations and rules are not being taught consistently. Lessons for behavior aren't even being used at all in the school. Staff seem to be disfluent at understanding their own school-wide expectations, which of course, you know, has ripple effects in how we monitor students and how we provide feedback. Classroom management procedures was an issue, as well as it seemed like the students themselves, not enough of them were really accessing the recognition portion or component of our PBIS system. And then on the academic side, again, going to that classroom environment and trying to understand this whole academic behavior influence, we know that we have evidence that the curricula that we're using and the instructional lessons that we're using aren't really scaffolded that meet students with where they're at in their prerequisite skill deficits. We're finding that a lot of kids are waiting a long time during instruction, which suggests issues around procedures and lesson design. We know that students lack sufficient English literacy skills because of previous data that we had on them. And then also too, in observing classrooms, found that universal design for learning and differentiated instruction practices aren't happening with Fidelity. So the idea here is that, yes, all of these are probably contributing to the problem. And now as a team, it's up to us. Do we want to try to tackle all of these, or do we want to just try to pick out a few of these, mess with those, and then see if we get an impact on our outcomes? And if we don't, then let's go back to the other ones on this list and keep chipping away until we find that one battery that works, like I mentioned in the previous analogy. So they did that, and I just want to highlight here that they started with looking at their self-assessment for MTSS as they thought about, you know, what's missing in their system that might explain why kids aren't doing well academically. And while they found that with their academic tiers, they felt that their rating of implementation suggests that, you know, they're pretty good at having the structures for tiers 1 and 2 in place for English language arts. But as they looked at all the different components of MTSS, it was the fact that their behavior tier system was very weak. Then you look at the capacity component, which is their coaching supports and other resources to support staff also seem to be low. And so that led them to start thinking more about, you know, is it something with a lack of fidelity in our behavior system that's contributing to these academic outcomes? They went to their benchmarks of quality, which is the tool that we use in Florida for measuring tier 1 fidelity rates for PBIS. And they found, you know, looking at their own data, historically, they've not been doing PBIS with fidelity at tier 1. And when they broke those components down there, you can see in the middle graph here, a number of the different 10 components were missing from their tier 1 system. And so they honed in on all of that and began to then develop their plan. And so in this basically was where they started to take those valid hypotheses and start thinking about what will we do to either get practices that aren't happening to happen or practices that shouldn't be happening to stop happening. So they built a comprehensive plan, which is what the purpose of this step is. At the end of this step, you have a very comprehensive plan that's extremely detail oriented. We need to know what specifically is going to happen, when, where, who's going to support those who are intervening with the students so that the fidelity of this intervention is happening, what data we're going to be collecting, and then the decision rules is a big piece that brings us today's topic. So here is just bringing us back to the valid hypotheses. We said that expectations were not being taught. Okay, so let's maybe provide a booster for staff to then remember those school-wide expectations and rules, and let's ensure that they do have that common language and understanding about our expectations. If staff are not recognizing students appropriately, then let's go beef that part up of our tier 1 structure for our behavior. Let's first of all review those procedures with all of the staff. Let's set administrative expectations that this is a component that we all need to be participating in using. But then also let's monitor that we are in fact using the recognition system. So we're going to provide Fidelity data to staff on a regular basis, but we're also going to be tracking those dollars that students take to their store to see if students are in fact accessing the store and if all the students have at least one chance to do that. So those are actions they can take to beef up the behavior side. On the academic side, they know that, you know, we're not really teaching appropriate behaviors. So let's go provide some technical assistance to develop behavior plans and to start use more of our social, emotional, or behavioral curricula. Classroom management procedures aren't happening, and so let's provide some in-service training, some technical assistance to get that fidelity up. Students are having long wait times. Again, that brings us back to providing some more coaching technical assistance to the grade level teams on how to develop lesson plans that have a nice flow of procedures where we don't have that downtime. And then similarly, provide coaching technical assistance to beef up the fidelity of their universal design for learning practices. So combination, these are all the practices that they set out to implement throughout the school year for 1920. Now, several months later, they're coming back to the table and they want to make a decision, how well has this been working? And so the basic idea here is that the student data you collect, again, whether it's tier 1, 2, or 3, can be described as one of 3 types. It's either a good response, meaning that the students' responses are improving so well that it's going to help you to reach your goal. Or there are times when student responses are improving compared to baseline or before the intervention, where, yeah, it's improved, but it's not enough to reach the goal. And then there are poor student responses where we're just not really seeing any impact at all, or definitely not enough to ever reach the goal. So that's the first piece in this step, is define the kind of progress you're getting. Is it a good response, a questionable response, or a poor response? And so thinking about this case study, they said they wanted to have 45% of their 3rd and 5th graders proficient. Well, fast forwarding then to this school year, they found that they had 43%. So it was a progress. It was an improvement over the 39% that they had at baseline, but they did not meet the goal. So we're going to call this particular response a questionable response. They also had the goal of reducing the amount of students who had more than 2 or more ODRs. They wanted 100% of their 3rd or 5th graders having no more than 1. Well, they had some success there too. Only 92% of their 3rd and 5th graders had more than 1 ODR. So it's a success as well, but again, didn't meet the goal. So we're going to call that also a questionable response. So for both of these goals, we had a questionable response in our student data. The question for the team now is, what's our next steps? We know some of this worked. It didn't work all the way. What do we do now? This is where we get to decision rules. This is that step 4 when we're asking ourselves, what is it about what we did that worked? And what might we do differently next to get even more power out of our effort or to get better outcomes? So we take a simple kind of a table like this. You can see those student outcomes at the top that I mentioned, but now consider too that what we do to improve our outcomes can either occur with high fidelity or low fidelity. And so then you just look at the combination here. So we talked about our case study here, and we talked about the fact that they had a questionable response on both goals. So that's going to put us right there squarely in that middle column right away. What we have to know now is, did we do our step 3, our comprehensive plan with fidelity? Was it high fidelity or low fidelity? So the idea behind the fidelity piece is, for example, ask yourselves this: did you reach your goal? If the answer is yes, great. Celebrate success, communicate to all your stakeholders what worked and why it worked so that everybody has that historical knowledge going forward and they can help maintain those practices. And then move on to the next problem that you want to deal with at your school. But if you didn't reach your goal, then you're not done solving that problem. Problem solving is not a one-cycle process. It's a continuous improvement process. And so here what we're saying is, if you didn't reach your goal, then the next question is, did you implement your plan with fidelity? And if you did, then okay, then it's not the actions that didn't work. It's just maybe we missed something in our problem solving process. Maybe we missed some variables that we need to consider. So let's go back and revisit problem solving, and let's see if we can figure out what additionally we might try. But if we did not implement our plan with fidelity, then there's nothing new to discover here other than what are those barriers to fidelity, address those barriers, troubleshoot them, and then go back and redo your plan. And so that's the logic here. Just to put it in kind of layman's terms, you know, you might ask yourself, why isn't my TV turning on? Well, I went ahead and I thought, maybe it's the battery. So I went and got some new batteries. All right, well, did that help you to turn your TV on? Yes, great, enjoy. If it didn't, then ask yourself, well, did you put in the new batteries the right way? If you did, then you might say, okay, well, are those batteries dead batteries, or maybe the remote's not working? So you kind of adjust your thinking. But if you didn't put the batteries in the right way, then you put them in the right way. So this is that logic of using monitoring data, fidelity data, plus progress monitoring data together to make decisions. When we make decisions like this, we reduce the time constraints on us. We improve the targetedness of our resources. We basically increase efficiency and effectiveness of how we solve problems. If we were to say, you know what, this intervention kind of worked, but we don't dig into why, we don't build on this work, we end up starting from scratch, and that eats away time. So we want to build continuously on the success of approximations and the progress that we're making. So there are different things that we want to measure when it comes to fidelity, and I don't want to belabor this because of the time's sake here. But when we're monitoring our MTSS policies and practices, this is where your BOQ, your TFI, your walkthrough data, your self-assessment of MTSS data, that is data around the system structures to support using evidence-based practices. So we want to know that those are happening with fidelity. We're collecting data throughout the entire year for a variety of different purposes. We want to be following those assessment protocols exactly where we're supposed to so that we can trust that data. We're making decisions about who's going to get what from our tiers and how we're going to give it to them. Well, that means using this problem-solving process the way it's designed with fidelity too. If we don't do the process well, we might make the wrong decisions. And then, of course, then we make decisions, we provide services to kids. We want to make sure that those services are also to provide with fidelity. So fidelity isn't something that exists just for interventions at tiers 2 and 3. Fidelity is speaking to, are we the adults doing what we say we're trying to do on paper? And then now we can make judgments about how much of that is actually having an impact for us. So this is just to summarize that case study, then to show you what happens for them. Again, they had questionable progress on both their goals in the middle column there, and they found that they did have high fidelity. The majority of actions that they intended to complete, they did in fact complete. So the middle top column box there, you can see their next steps are already pre-planned. There isn't a lot of extra conversation they have to do other than maybe the logistics. They're going to confirm the fidelity of the action steps just to make sure they didn't miss any. They're going to continue to plan as to how to get more power out of this to reach their goals, but they're going to celebrate the fact that it is in fact working. They're going to communicate and share their stakeholders. They're going to review more disaggregated data and further analyze how they might maybe supplement their plan to get a little bit more power out of it. And then of course, they're going to determine what those next steps are and then define the next round of problem solving. So that's essentially what it means to monitor your fidelity data and your progress monitoring data together so that you're making continuous improvement cycles. Again, if you treat problem solving as a one or done event, like, hey, we did problem solving for this group of kids at tier 2 and oops, it didn't work and we didn't bother to check fidelity, then we're assuming then that it's the kids' fault, they need something more, and we start putting kids into tier 3 when in fact, maybe they could have benefited from tier 2. Conversely, we can have lots of kids struggling at tier 1. We do a lot of things to help them at tier 1. We don't see the responses we want, but we never check the fidelity of our actions at tier 1. And so we make assumptions that these kids need more, and now we're putting all those kids into tier 2, and now you have an upside down triangle. So we have to always be monitoring outcome data of our students in relation to the practices we said we're going to do to get the outcomes we want. So just rounding out this conversation real quickly here, just for those of you with the district process, again, this process is data-based, is an evidence-based process. There are some handouts there for you if you'd like to see a little bit of the literature behind that. But again, this process has to occur with fidelity. And so conditions are needed at the school to support teams to be able to use this process with fidelity. And this is where the districts come involved, especially school-based leaders as well. So we have to have an expectation that is explicit to all the schools that this is a component of our MTSS system. And we need to all be on the same page about what it sounds like, what it looks like, and how it's conducted procedurally. We want to make sure that there's a data culture that values the use of data to make decisions, and that we get out of this habit of, well, I believe, or I think, or I feel. You know, it's always that kind of comment that I've heard some of my colleagues say sometimes, in God we trust, with all others bring data. So again, we want to make sure that, our leaders are being the role models of that. if they're providing staff trainings or staff meetings or what have you, that when they're referring to problems in the school, they're referencing data and they're demonstrating this process in regular conversation. Your data systems and platforms is an important foundation to help teams to access the right data at the right time, and in a visualization report that helps them to summarize information quickly. You have to have effective teaming practices to support collaborative decision-making and conversations, data coaching supports, and of course, along the way, we're building up the capacity of everyone to have higher data literacy skills. So these are foundational to this fidelity of the process. This is just to highlight an example of that. You can see that if we provide training to folks, it gets only a minimal amount of any of that actually happening in classrooms. It's not until we provide that site-based coaching in the moment about how to use data and make decisions this way that we start to see those kinds of practices happening. So with that, it is now 1:30. I saw a lot of comments kind of coming through, but I didn't hear any need to stop, but now's the time. So Emily, I'm going to turn it over back to you, and please guide us to decide how we want to facilitate these questions that we might have. Thank you, everyone.
Yes, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Brian Gaunt. I really appreciate it. We are going to open up to question and answer. We do have just a couple questions that had come in earlier, and they're a little bit lengthy, so I thought it was appropriate to leave those here towards the end. Give me just 1 second here to pull this all together while I'm going to get our final questions presentation up here. Well, maybe I am. I apologize. Here we go. Get Zoom clicking and working. There we are. So we're going to get to as many questions today as we can. And for those of you whose questions are not answered, or if you have additional questions, you can email those with the session and Dr. Brian Gaunt's name to sissel@k12.wa.us. So our first question, Dr. Gaunt, we had somebody ask about, she said, when I think about the involvement of threat assessment teams at higher tiers, does it make sense to involve, for example, school security at a tier 1 level with certain data so that there aren't as many kids moving to those higher levels? We often think of these individuals for responding to negative situations rather than mitigating them. Or am I not understanding tiers? If you wait to look at that discipline data, is it really too late?
Excellent question. Excellent question. And first of all, just to highlight for the person who gave that question, you're actually on the mark in terms of where you're headed in the spirit of that question. The approach or the perspective of those of us who've been doing this for quite some time is that this is an all hands on deck approach. So, you know, pick an employee, whatever their role is, school psychologist, safety, special education teacher, general education teacher, administrator, social worker, whatever they are, they have a defined set of practices or responsibilities that they have. I want everybody at every one of those areas of work to think about what they contribute to tier 1, to tier 2, and to tier 3. There are some personnel that you would think just by nature of the work that they do that they're already pigeoned into, let's say, a tier 3 level, like you say, your threat assessment teams, or maybe even your student services personnel or special ed folks. But again, it's an all hands on deck preventative model. And so, for example, you might think of special education teachers. I know a case study in one of our school districts where in all of their elementary schools, they had a high number of kids who had very poor early literacy skills because they had no preschool experience. Like half their preschool kids come in with no preschool experience. Or half their kindergarten kids come in. And that was a problem. And then you could see in their data, it was a lagging problem that would just continue year after year for them. So rather than put all those kids in tier 2, knowing there's so many of them, they brought in their speech and language pathologists, they brought in their special education teachers, and those folks acted as consultants to the general education teachers in kindergarten around what modifications or enhancements they can make to their lesson plans for kindergarten such that we can build up remedially, in a remedial kind of a way, either speech and language issues or early literacy issues, such that then we don't have to put those kids into tier 2 or tier 3. It's just really our tier 1 is modified to address this large population needs. So when I think about safety, I do think it's important that the message gets across that anybody involved in the nature of school safety, that we do still operate from a perspective of prevention matters most. And so what is it about safety at tier 1? And that's where I would say go back to framing it in your PBIS. Go back to describing how when we get kids and teachers to focus on what we want as pro-social behaviors, including our safety and securities, then everybody's there to help monitor and ensure that we're meeting those behavior expectations. And that's what certainly our security officers and folks on site can help support to do. It's a great question.
Well, thank you very much. So our next question is a request. So please address how MTSS can address the needs of advanced learners who are not learning in the Tier 1 general education instructional program.
Excellent question. So again, MTSS is for all. And when we say all, we mean all. So it doesn't mean kids who are just at risk, doesn't mean kids who are failing. And so for our gifted students or students who are high performing, it's important that they still continually make growth as well. But this is where we have to also bring in that content expertise around instructional design to know that those are the kinds of individuals for whom it may not be a matter of giving them new content as much as different learning experiences that further reinforce the content in a way that makes it more fluid and generalizable. So this is where you start thinking about situations or evidence-based practices such as PALS, peer-assisted learning. You take a high-performing student, you match them with a low-performing student. The high-performing student is benefiting too, and the research shows this. It's that old adage that we used to say is, the best way to learn something is to teach it. So I can learn something to demonstrate accuracy of knowledge in a % correct type test, or I can learn something to perform it in a fluent way, or I can learn something to not only perform it fluently, but to show you how I can apply it in different cases at different times in different places in a generalized way. And so the same thing exists really in every context. So I feel like in many cases, MTSS, it still comes back to, for every population of students, what are the needs? And do you have something in your tiers to match that need so that they can access it? After that, it's the logistics of implementing in your tiered structure. Do you have the calendar schedules to support folks accessing that? When you've got your intervention blocks, what are you doing to enhance kids who are already high performing? And so these are things that certainly we see some schools doing. It may not be universal, but there's nothing to prevent MTSS from helping kids who are at the higher range of performance or who are gifted.
Thank you so much. So I do just want to kind of close us out here. I know that we have a question or two that was left unanswered. We will get those sent to Dr. Brian Gaunt and try to get those responses. We'll get those posted. And just on behalf of OSPI, I'd just like to thank you for joining us. Please email us if you have any additional questions. And like I said, include the session name and presenter in the subject line at CISL, CISL at k12.wa.us. And I just want to say thank you again, everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.